So, in this video, I'm going to talk about the job that I worked when I moved up to Collingwood in South Ontario. And this was between, I think it was between September of 2019 and March 2020. So this was up until the time of the pandemic. So I worked basically as a front desk clerk and a switchboard operator for the resort. So my duties mainly consisted of the following. First of all, I had to check in guests upon arrival. We would have a roster of all the guests that were scheduled to arrive each morning. And typically I worked... Did I work morning shifts? I think I worked morning shifts, although sometimes I worked in the... sometimes I worked evening shifts, so I'd also be in charge of checking out the guests too. So I'd be verifying things like their personal information, making sure it was all correct on the system. I'd also be giving them the keys to their rooms. And I'd be giving them pamphlets and little information booklets about the resort and what kind of amenities we'd had, and also directions for where they needed to go if they were due to attend conferences, because that's another thing. A lot of the clients and customers we got were, well, they were fairly quite well-to-do. This was a stopping place between the Blue Mountain ski resorts, after all, so they were likely headed for living water, mainly because they were going to head off to the ski resort sometime later. And a lot of conferences were being held there. It's funny, you know, before I ever properly worked in the hospitality industry, especially in tourist resorts, I didn't know that it was possible to hold conferences or events in a function room or anything like that. But yeah, apparently it's a big part of how they make money. Some of the guests even had this strange... There was this weird thing called a timeshare, and I still don't quite fully understand it. But if there's anybody watching this who has a better understanding of business and real estate and so on, you can probably explain it a lot better than I can. But essentially, a timeshare is essentially when you have some kind of lease on one of the rooms in the hotel, in the resort, and you basically get to lease it out to other people for a period of time. It was a program that we held out, and there were lots of perks that came with it, including things like breakfast and dining vouchers, spa treatments. Yeah, our clients were quite wealthy, and we'd reward them with a lot of perks. We'd reward our patrons with lots of special gifts. It was quite bizarre because the entire time I worked there, I was basically living paycheck to paycheck, because half the money I earned every 2 weeks, it would go towards basically go towards the rent. The other half would go towards things like basic living expenses. Because it ain't easy, let me tell you. It's not easy being an unskilled worker in a foreign country. It's funny, you know, this one experience, I would say, it taught me the value of having a family that will support you. Because if I didn't have a family, I honestly wouldn't have made it. I'm going to get into that topic a little deeper in my next video. But anyway, yes, it wasn't easy work. I mean, the job itself was relatively straightforward. A lot of the tasks I did were basically, I'd do the same thing each time. I'd check in the guests or check out the guests. And when the phone rang, sometimes I had to answer it. I'd redirect the call to the right department. We had a list of extensions that we would redirect incoming callers to. Sometimes the guests would call and they'd ask for things like fluffy pillows, or one of their children wet the bed or something like that, so we need to change the bed sheets. Pretty standard stuff, I'd say. And we didn't do room service. And you know, it's funny, I've been to a number of different hotels in my life, and I don't remember a single one that actually did room service. Is there actually a hotel that does do room service? Because I'm not convinced that there is. I've seen a lot of TV shows where they, you know, there's typically a scene like in Home Alone 2 when Kevin stays at this fancy hotel and he calls for room service. Often in our media, when we're depicting somebody living a rich, pampered lifestyle, usually as a consequence of either ill-gotten gains or having won the lottery, you know, being very rich, they would often go to a hotel and they'd, I don't know, sit in a jacuzzi with one of those, you know, one of those mobile phones and call for room service. But I'm not convinced that that's an actual thing. Is there actually a hotel that does do room service? I'd be very interested to know if there was, but so far I haven't come across one. Anyway, that was more or less the sum total of what I did. Pretty standard stuff. We had this financial incentive to upsell the rooms that we were checking our customers into. For instance, if they would stay in a single room, we would try and encourage them to upgrade to a double room, or a master's bedroom or something like that. And if we did, we got a commission fee. And most customers aren't, most customers are, they're just looking for a place to spend the night. They're too wary of salesmanship tactics, because we try and put pressure on people to upscale their rooms. But I did it a couple of times. I did, in fact, manage to successfully convince a few customers here and there to scale up. But deep in my heart, I don't think I've got what it takes to be a true salesman, because there's something very dark and shady about the sales industry. Basically, it's little different, in my opinion. True salesmanship is a little different from being a confidence trickster. Basically, you're trying to convince people to part with their money. You're trying to sell them stuff that they don't actually fundamentally need. And I think there's something quite dark about it. Now, if you're being incentivized or encouraged to upsell rooms like that, well, you got to do what you got to do. But there are some people who just seem to have no conscience whatsoever. And those people, they thrive in the sales environment. It reminds me, one of the biggest examples of this that made me realize this is that there was this Netflix drama called White Gold. I remember seeing a couple of years ago. It's a drama set in the 1980s about all these door-to-door. What is it they sell? They sell insulation, I think. Yes. It's these unscrupulous salesmen who work for a company that provides insulation into houses for homeowners. And the series is meant to be a comedy, but it's also quite horrifying, and I refuse to believe that the series is not at least partially based on the real life shady tactics that real business people do. Because there's one scene I remember in the very first episode of that show where one of the guys who works they make a bet on whether they can God, I should have watched the episode before I talked about this. One of the guys makes a bet that he can sell, more, what is it, PVC panels or more greater insurance on one of his customers, and he decides to do that purely to make, not because he's interested in the welfare of his customer, but just basically to satisfy his own ego and to make a point. It's a very cutthroat environment. Maybe, I don't know if that series is based on reality or anything like that. I hope it isn't, but I have a feeling it is. Anyway, I went off on a bit of a wild tangent there, but yeah, basically the sales environment, it's not really something I could see myself doing because for all my faults, I have a conscience. And I don't think there's any room for people like me in the world of sales. So anyway, that was basically that was what I did while I worked there. Checking in guests, checking them out, showing the guests where the guest services are, speaking with housekeeping, communicating about minor problems in the resort, asking for things like fluffy pillows or if there was a mouse, because sometimes we would get wildlife in and around the resort, and that's the thing I remember we had to watch out for. And we'd call the resident pest control to deal with that. All in all, pretty standard stuff. Now, what was my overall experience of the job? Well, I feel like a lot of our experience and a lot of your personal recollection of when we look back on an experience we've had working for a company, I think we tend to value that experience depending on how it's turned out, and how much money you make, I think, is inextricably linked with our overall opinion of it. The fact of the matter is, I was living on-site accommodation. I think I was getting paid basically minimum wage. There was some extra money to be found through commission fees and stuff like that, but half of the money would be spent on the on-site accommodation. So a lot of the time I was I was living paycheck to paycheck, and it was quite stressful because I had to budget and watch out for how much money I was spending. So it was quite stressful. And the thing is with me, naturally, I'm not that good at budgeting. I'm not that good at suspending momentary pleasures for the long-term future. I was hoping the entire time, the whole plan, if there was a plan, because there wasn't really a plan, for me going to Canada was that I would find a job and save up enough money so I could go traveling. But the job that I worked, it had its perks. It was a very nice location. I definitely had some memorable times there, but overall it didn't give me, I wasn't compensated enough financially to enjoy the lifestyle that I was hoping I'd get to have. And for that reason, it was a job more than anything else. It was, although one positive I will say, it was miles better than the last job I had. Because the last job I had, the one I got fired from, I loathed more or less every single second of that job. I loathed it so much, I was conflicted when I got fired because I couldn't tell whether I was happy or displeased at the time. It left a huge dent in my psyche, getting sacked from that job. But I didn't experience anything like that with this particular job. And overall, most of the people, it's important, not everyone, but most of the people I met at my place of work for this job as a front desk clerk, they were all right. Some of them were around my age, and we had a lot to talk about. But not everyone was all right. Now, there was one manager in particular who I don't look back on, who I didn't like. He was a piece of shit. I'm not going to sugarcoat my opinion of the man because, well, I find it unlikely. It's unlikely he's going to come across this channel. it's highly likely that the man is, unfortunately, probably still alive out there somewhere, probably living at large, exploiting more people working underneath him and sitting on his ill-gotten gains somewhere. But I don't care, whatever. I did not like working for him. And for the sake of, because I want to avoid real trouble, I'm not going to use his real name. I'm going to use his nickname, which I coined for him, because it sounds vaguely similar to his last name. So anyway, I'm going to call him Weasel, because that's exactly what he was. He was a weasel. I mean, physically, at least on appearance, he was relatively, how can I put this? There wasn't really much about him. He was like 5'7" or 5'8". Even though the man was in his mid to late 30s, he didn't look that remarkable or impressive. There was nothing about his appearance to suggest that he was a manager. He had this ginger beard that was all puffy and made him look kind of like a homeless man. I don't think he really took good care of his appearance. His skin sort of looked more aged than it really was. You know, actually, I have a theory that when he went to school, everyone bullied him. Everyone bullied him so much, but instead of trying to improve himself and fight back and stand up for himself and defeat the bullies, he basically grew into a resentful adult, a resentful middle manager who took out his resentment and anger on people who were younger than him. That's basically my theory on this guy's villain arc, if you want to call it that. Because that's more or less the kind of person Weasel was. So when I first started working under Weasel, when he was first showing me the ropes of the front desk clerk, at first he seemed to be all right, you know. I even impressed him because I actually had experience working behind the front desk of a resort before. That's something I haven't actually talked much about. But yeah, a lot of the check-in stuff seemed pretty intuitively easy. I knew what to do at times without him even telling me to. And the signs were not present at first, but it was weeks or perhaps months later that I began to see who he really was. So first of all, he was impatient. He was fussy. Like, he didn't like repeating himself even once. Like, if there was a misunderstanding where he'd said something, but perhaps I didn't remember it, he'd get annoyed at me for that. And, well, I don't claim to be the perfect employee. And yeah, it is often sometimes people will say things to me and I'll only remember, I think, maybe half of it at the most. But most people, I think, are relatively forgiving of that. Most people don't mind being in a position to forgive themselves because most people can see that some things take time. Some tasks are quite complex and you need to try at them over and over before you get the hang of it. I mean, to give you an example, I'm really bad at remembering people's names. More often than not, I'll need to ask somebody's name 3 or 4 times before I remember it. But once I do remember it, I never forget it. But he wasn't like that. Now, he was short-tempered, and I didn't really get the feeling that he was invested in me as an employer. Basically, he just, again, this is just my psychological, my own theory of mind here. I don't know what the guy was thinking, but he probably looked at me. He probably saw that I was a whole foot taller than him and I was younger than him, and he thought, piece of shit. I'm gonna make him feel uncomfortable to satisfy my ego. I'm gonna make him feel worthless and out of place here. I'm gonna make unreasonable requests of him and watch him flummox and get neurotic and paranoid, and I'm gonna convince him that it's all his fault, because that's basically what happened. there were times when I made small mistakes. Now, this was 5 or 6 years ago, and it has been such a long time since I spent my time working behind the front desk. I can't even remember more or less the specifics of what the mistakes I made even were. Perhaps I would check in a guest on arrival earlier than they were scheduled to arrive, or I would give the wrong information. But other managers were patient. He wasn't. And what made me especially angry, well, there were two things in particular that made me angry, is that he held me to a higher standard than any of the other managers did. And if you hold someone to a higher standard of behavior, it's possible that it's because you see them as more confident and more competent and more capable. But that evidently wasn't the case with him, because he didn't balance out his criticisms of me with any positive feedback. And speaking of which, another thing I remember is he never apologized. He was actually, the words he used, I think, they were very deliberate and specific. So he, like for instance, on one occasion, I just left to go on my lunch break, and I ordered something from the bar and grill, and I'd spent 4 or 5 minutes past the bar and grill, and he lost his temper with me. He's saying, I'm going to be late for this meeting that I got to go to. I told you to get back here at 5:30 or 7 or 8 or whenever it was. And there were other customers there around to hear this. And one of them actually came up to me and said, hey, I think the way that guy spoke to you was unacceptable. But at the time, I was so, psychologically within his thrall. I was so convinced that what I did was unreasonable that I said to the customer, it's my fault. I should have been here earlier. I should have been here earlier. And then the next morning, he spoke to me in a conciliatory manner, as if he crossed the line the other day, but he didn't say he was sorry. What he said, his exact words were, so obviously the language, what I said last night, it wasn't cool. Are we cool? No, those were his words. Are we cool? As if last night it was a misunderstanding and nothing else. It's not like he didn't just lose his temper with me in front of all those other people. Oh yeah, and then there was one other occasion where I'd relayed incorrect information to one particular customer, which was incidentally, it was Weasel's fault. Weasel was the one who gave me this information. And then when Weasel came back to me and told me that I'd relayed this incorrect information, and I reminded him that it was he himself who gave me this information, did he apologize or take responsibility? No. What he said, his exact words were, I'm sorry that you felt that. I'm sorry that you believed that. Not, I'm sorry that I told you that. That was my mistake. And this was a common pattern of behavior with him. And to add to this, another thing that frustrated me is he also held me to a different standard of behavior than the other co-workers who I was with. So incidentally, a lot of the people who I spent my time working at the resort with, for some weird reason, they were all Indians. No, they were all people from India, Indian immigrants. Yeah, there must have been at least 5 or 6. It was very strange. But the way he treated them was noticeably different to how he treated me. So for instance, there was one Indian colleague, who was sat up on the desk with her feet on the desk. And he didn't say a word to her, even though, and I don't mean to sound prejudiced or bigoted, but honestly, if I saw a colleague doing that, or one of my underlings, I would have told them off, because that was unprofessional, giving the wrong look. But he had a real bee in his bonnet about me spending my leisure time, when there were no customers around, nobody in sight, on Reddit. This was back when I used Reddit. I mean, I don't use Reddit anymore because my account actually got banned many years ago. he was really angry with me at this. For some reason, I wasn't looking at porn or violent graphic content or anything like that. I was just cruising random subreddits, mostly stuff about stuff about anime and memes. But anyway, I was self-conscious enough to close the window whenever we had a customer come by. But yeah, it was, I began to notice that there was a distinct pattern of behavior from this guy. He would treat me differently to how he treated other members of his staff. He never apologized to me. He never directly acknowledged whenever he made a mistake. And I began to notice, whenever he would call me into his office, whenever he'd summon me into his office, I always felt a shiver down my spine, because it was never for a good reason. You know, the other managers I'd worked for, they were, I had a more or less a neutral and even a positive opinion about them, because their critiques, I think, were well-intentioned and they were balanced. But his never were. It got to the point where, and at the time, I was totally convinced that it was my fault. That I was performing badly because I wasn't taking in what he was telling me. It just didn't occur to me that he had a chip on his shoulder, that guy. And I can't specifically point to what it was. It's very complicated now that I look back, because, for instance, if he was an Indian, then his treatment of the other Indian staff compared to how he treated me, it all would have made sense. But it's weird because he wasn't. He was white, Canadian, and he was a nerdy little with glasses and a thick ginger beard. Somebody, honestly, I guarantee you this, if I'd gone to school with this guy and we were in the same year and everybody was bullying him, I would have joined in, because he was a little he probably deserved it, that little But anyway, no, that nerdy little has since become a 30-something-year-old embittered adult who likes to take out his vengeful, resentful attitude on younger people who've done nothing to upset or inconvenience him. And that was probably more or less the main thing that soured my experience working for Living Water. Well, I say that though, it's not that I truly hated working there. It's not that I don't look back. It's not like there weren't some good positive times for here or there, because some of the staff were good as gold. Some of the staff over there really made me feel welcome and like a valued member of the team. And there were some good times that we had back there. One of them actually, God bless her soul, Alison, the head of guest services, the guest services director, she actually gave me a Christmas present. This nice big bag full of Christmas goods. It was really sweet of her. I'll never forget that. Because people like her made me genuinely regret the fact that I had to leave the country and never come back at the time of the pandemic. I'll get into how that happened in a later video. But it was, on the whole, it was all right. I got more or less what I wanted out of my experience working at the resort. I learned how to use the check-in and check-out software. I didn't get fired. Well, not in the same. I did actually get fired, but for an entirely different reason. Nothing like what happened last time. And I left on relatively good terms with all the other members of staff. A lot of them were boomers. Some of them were in their 50s or 60s. But I remember spending a lot of time enjoying some idle conversation with them. Oh yeah, we were talking about Jeffrey Epstein's death, and because it was in mid-2019 that Jeffrey Epstein's mysterious suicide happened, and I was telling them about what I thought really happened. because back then the event was still fresh in everybody's memories. And sometimes we discussed even political stuff, but there was one particular coworker who was around my age, and we were talking about stuff like video games, anime, and memes and things like that. I even got on well with some of the Indians too. There's one Indian guy and I. We ended up having an interesting conversation about the British Empire. It was around this time that I found out just what most Indians think about the British Empire, and I think this was my views on Indians. I'm probably going to have to talk about this in a different video, but I treat people as individuals, and individually, the Indians I met, they were all right for the most part. There were people who gave me trouble at that place of work, but it weren't the Indians who were doing it. And, and also, it wouldn't be a complete review if I didn't talk about the food, because the food there was absolutely gorgeous. If you want my opinion, it was definitely that one time where I spent 4 minutes or so past my lunch break eating those barbecue chicken wings with sriracha, those buffalo chicken wings with sriracha sauce. Definitely worth it. I also got to experience some prime Canadian cuisine, maple syrup with pancakes, because that's a big thing over there. Canadians love maple syrup with pancakes. Wasn't any poutine at the restaurant, but I'd already been there and tried that, and I was in the mood for something different. I didn't really spend a lot of time in using the amenities like the pool or the gym. Only when I felt bored, but as an employee, I did have the right to use the pool, I think typically when guests weren't using it. That was fun. But the best part, is it the best part, or am I exaggerating due to recollection bias? Well, no. One thing that I found especially memorable and iconic about my stay there is because I stayed during the winter months. My stay was between September 2019 to March of the following year. We got snow. And you got to understand that in England, especially in southern England where I'm from, snow it's something that literally only comes every 4 or 5 years, and we don't get a lot of it. It doesn't happen very often, certainly not during Christmas time. I think there's only one occasion I can recall where it actually did snow around December 25th. But usually it snows once between the months of, I think, November and February of the following year. And the snow is never that thick. Well, rarely is it that thick. We're lucky if we get sleet sometimes. So if you've ever seen those postcard pictures of people skating on the River Thames, which is frozen down, or people making snowmans, like in that Raymond Briggs picture book, yeah, we get nothing like that down here. But in Canada, it's an entirely different story. First of all, snow comes thick and fast, but it doesn't happen once or twice. It comes in waves. It's not out of place for there to be at least... How thick was the snow? Something like 5 or 7 inches. Well, sometimes we'd have a whole foot or 2 feet's worth of snow outside the door for our accommodation, and there'd be icicles hanging from the porch. And I've read that in some parts of Canada, it gets so cold during the winter, people literally have to leave their engines running overnight because otherwise the fuel will freeze inside and then they can't drive anywhere. And make no mistake, it certainly did get bloody cold up there. I recall many occasions where I'd stare wide-eyed at my phone when it said that the temperature in Collingwood was something like -20 degrees Celsius. And this was, by the way, without the wind chill factor. With wind chill factor, it felt even colder than it was. I like to spend a lot of my time running outside my local neighborhood. And sometimes I stop running if it gets too cold. I had to do that. I actually had to do that quite a bit when I was living in Collingwood. Because I remember thinking, Jesus Christ, it's so cold. I'm actually going to get frostbite if I hang around out here for too long. So I had to double back and take a warm shower. That was a bit of a culture shock. But it was also very beautiful because I know that if there's any Canadians or Americans watching this, you probably have a very jaded a view about snow. You probably think it's a nuisance because you have to drive your car to work, and snow blocking up the road must be a regular hazard for you, something that you actually have to contend with a lot during the winter months. But around here, where I'm from, snow is something that you only see once every couple of years. It's like a rare bird. You're going to miss it if you're unlucky. So, getting a taste of that, seeing a real Canadian winter, it was a sight to behold. And I really enjoyed it. I have some very positive memories, even of walking through the thick snow and just being utterly mesmerized by the beauty. Just walking through the nearby woods, it felt like I was in Narnia. It was a really special feeling. I've got loads of pictures of it all saved on my phone, and I treasure looking back on those times because that was part of the reason that I chose to go to Canada specifically, because it really was, you had to see it to believe it. Anyway, gosh, I've 37.5 minutes. I'm going to be late for finishing my collection if I carry on this. But there is more to talk about. I'm going to try and wrap up this video series next time I do. But there's a lot more that I got to get through. Anyway, this has been Tracking. Hope you guys are doing well. Take care, everyone.